Antinatalism has the potential to do a lot of good things in the world, including preventing more beings from ever coming into existence to feel suffering in the first place. But the role that it's going to play in the wider effort of making the world a better place for the beings who are going to be in it, and also just the fact that there will be less beings in it, is kind of unclear. In this video, I want to look at how antinatalism could play a role in that wider movement of doing good things in the world by looking at the essays of two people, and those people are Magnus Vinding and Tomasik. So these essays are Antinatalism and the Future of Suffering by Magnus and Strategic Considerations for Moral Antinatalists by Brian. And I will link both of those essays in the description and links to their website as well, so that you can see their wider writings and where they're coming from and all of that sort of stuff. But just as a brief introduction to both these guys before we get into the main things in the video, they both come generally from a negative utilitarian perspective with concern for all sentient beings. So that means that their main driver when thinking about ethics is reducing the suffering of any suffering individual in the universe, regardless of their race, their sex, their class, their caste, their species, and any other characteristic which is morally irrelevant when it comes to thinking about suffering. Now, obviously not all antinatalists come from this perspective. Some antinatalists are only concerned with specific individuals, or suffering isn't their main concern, but I think a decent chunk of antinatalists do come from this general perspective, where their primary concern is the creation of individuals who can suffer. Now, before we get into the bulk of this video, I want to clarify two key things. The first thing is that the ideas in this video are not a critique of philanthropic antinatalism, the idea that it is better for the individual not to come into existence, that existence is a harm for them. What the ideas in this video pertain to are the potential real-world consequences of if antinatalism actually gets taken seriously and catches on. The second thing is that I don't really put forward any answers in this video. It's more I want to put forward these ideas so that they can be taken into account when people are considering what direction they want to help push antinatalist activism in. And obviously the direction that the antinatalist movement goes in is not going to be determined by any one person or any one video or anything like that. It's going to be determined by all the different people who make an effort in the movement. So I think now those two things are covered, I think we can get into it. When talking about antinatalism in isolation, obviously the best way to prevent suffering is simply just not to create beings who can suffer in the first place. In my eyes, that is the core of antinatalism, and I think in isolation it makes sense, and I personally have not heard any good arguments against it. But obviously we don't live in isolation. At some point, if we have ethical beliefs that we think can make the world a better place, they are going to have to come into contact with reality. Both our actions and inactions will have actual real-world consequences for morally relevant beings who either exist now or will exist in the future. And I think as antinatalists, we already recognize this in some of the critiques that we make of other communities or other movements. For example, it's often been said about effective altruists that they pursue doing good in the world, but some of the ways that they pursue doing good in the world, as they put it, actually results in more human births, and it expands the breeding of non-human animals as well. And as antinatalists, we see those two things as a harm. But obviously, if we're able to recognize those nuances in other movements, then we should be able to recognize them in the advocacy that we do as well, and recognize that our advocacy can have unintended consequences that we either were not aware were going to happen or we didn't think about long enough. I think recognizing these unintended consequences is really important because it's going to help determine for us what our priorities are going to be and where we should be putting our effort in. So I think, for example, some of these considerations might raise questions like, who do we want to help? How do we want to help them? What could the unintended consequences of taking those actions be? And how do we mitigate against those unintended consequences? And I think the answers to these questions are going to have very important implications for the future of antinatalist advocacy. And obviously, this is something that people have been talking about for years now. This is not like a new thing I'm bringing up. I merely want to make a sort of discrete package of information in this video to help add to the conversation, to hopefully push this conversation forward so that we can collectively provide more clarity to ourselves about where we want to put our efforts. So since 1965, the average number of children born per woman has halved, and this has been for three main reasons. Female empowerment, including getting access to jobs and education, declining infant mortality rates, and the increasing cost of raising a child. Now, this massive demographic shift has been happening for decades without any significant or meaningful input from antinatalist activism. However, with the rise of the internet, meaning that antinatalists across the world can connect up and communicate with each other, but also organize and communicate with the rest of the world as well, this could actually change, and we could see groups of antinatalists having more of an impact in the world. In his essay, Antinatalism and the Future of Suffering, Magnus Vinding talks about this and actually expresses concern about the impact that antinatalists can have. He argues that while the question of whether creating someone is a harm to them is an important question, it's not the most important question. Magnus believes that antinatalists are actually missing the bigger picture, and if we focus too much on the individual level harm of creating someone, we may actually end up doing more harm overall. So he asks us to imagine a world where antinatalism gains instant success, and within a year there are no more humans born at all. So unless any sort of radical life extension technology comes around, with no procreation, the human species would go extinct in around the year 2150. Now, obviously, many antinatalists would celebrate that. They would say things along the lines of no more humans, no more problems. But Magnus argues that there would actually still be problems, and that humans going extinct and leaving those problems behind would be a really bad thing to do. Now, obviously, if humans went extinct, then there would be no more humans, and there would likely be no more domesticated animals as well, because we would not be breeding them anymore. But Magnus says that we would be leaving behind wild animals, and he says that this could materialize an awful situation. Wild animals by and large have pretty awful lives, and in terms of numbers, there are more wild animals than there are domesticated animals and humans put together. And if humans were to go extinct, this number of wild animals would drastically increase above what it is at the moment. Now, if you want to get an understanding of why Magnus sees this as such a big issue, I would recommend Animal Ethics Introductory Course on Wild Animal Suffering, and also Humane Hancock did a good video on it as well, and I will link both of those in the description so that you can access them after this video and learn more about the character and the quality of wild animals' lives, and why Magnus sees it as such a serious issue to leave billions, trillions of them behind if humans went extinct. Now, obviously, given our poor track record with interacting with other animals, whether that be causing the suffering of many of the wild animals or systemically breeding domesticated animals into existence, basically just to torture and then kill them, a lot of people may be skeptical of Magnus's concern that humans should hang around to help animals. Someone may say that even though they do sympathize with the suffering of other animals, they think that humans sticking around would simply just make the issue worse. So in his essay, Strategic Considerations for Moral Antinatalists, Brian Tomasik shares the concern that Magnus has about humans going extinct, but he also recognizes the skepticism and the concern of other people who say that humans hanging around may actually cause more harm. Brian recognizes that each new human created will cause harm both directly and indirectly to other animals, especially if they're not vegan. But Brian actually argues that overall, humans have actually probably done more good than bad when it comes to wild animals, because we have simply displaced so much land that they would have been on and replaced it with human activity, that we've prevented so many more wild animals from coming into existence than would have come into existence if that land was still in its wild state. Now, if you want to get into the details of Brian's argument, you can go and read his essay, which is linked in the description, and he gets into all the nitty-gritty numbers there, which I don't really feel is that useful to regurgitate here. I just want to put his main point across, that he says actually humans have had an overall good impact on wild animal suffering, and that trend could continue in the future. So both Brian and Magnus say that whilst human extinction would stop human suffering, it would not stop all suffering. And actually, if we're looking at suffering generally and not splitting it up by species, it could actually increase suffering overall if humans went extinct. So they both seem to advocate for a form of antinatalism where they do see it as bad that sentient beings come into existence, but they argue that a human-centered message could actually be worse in the long run and result in more beings coming into existence. So they argue that the main priorities of the antinatalist antinatalist movement when it comes to preventing new beings from coming into existence should be 3 areas: stopping animal agriculture and systemically breeding domesticated animals into existence, alleviating wild animal suffering through wildlife antinatalism, which Magnus actually has a whole essay on specifically that, which I'll link in the description, and also preventing digital sentience from ever coming into existence to suffer as well, which we'll come back to later in the video. So the Cobra effect is when someone takes an action with the intention of improving an issue, but actually an unintended consequence of that action makes the issue worse. So the term originates from British colonial India, where the British wanted to get rid of a certain venomous snake in Delhi. And so what they did is they put a bounty on the head of every snake. So if someone brought the head of a snake to the British, they could claim an amount of money. And they thought what this would do is people would go out, kill the snake, collect their money, and then there would be no more of these snakes. But what actually started happening is that the locals started to farm these snakes and breed them. And through breeding them and then cutting their heads off and bringing them to the British, they made a business out of breeding these snakes. The British then cottoned on to this, realizing that they were just giving money away for nothing, and ended up stopping the bounty. So when the people breeding these snakes realized that the bounty was stopped and they weren't going to get any more money for these snakes, they just set all the snakes free that they had bred and not killed yet. And so at the end of this process, there were actually more of these venomous snakes in Delhi than there were before the British put this bounty in. And so this is why it was called the Cobra effect, because the British took an action which they intended to alleviate this issue, but it actually had an unintended consequence where it made it worse. But what does this have to do with antinatalism? Well, so far, both Brian and Magnus have been viewing human procreation as a means to human innovation and human altruism. Despite each human birth being a harm to that individual, the continuation of the human species overall in the long run will lead to less beings coming into existence. But what if they're wrong? What if the very procreation and innovation they hope will lead to altruism and an overall reduction in the amount of beings coming into existence? What if that would actually result in a dramatic increase in suffering? Maybe if that were the case, we should just focus on not making the situation worse than it is now and aim all our effort at a human-centered antinatalist message. And Brian considers this in his essay. An S-risk is something that has the potential to massively increase the amount of suffering that's going on, potentially more than has ever existed on Earth so far. And in the previous section, Magnus and Brian were talking about human extinction potentially being an S-risk, leading to a massive increase in suffering and beings coming into existence overall. But what if the opposite is true? What if it's not human extinction that is the S-risk, but what if it's human procreation that is the S-risk? Brian explains 2 key ways in which human procreation and the trend of innovation that we're seeing with humans could actually result in a massive increase in how bad the situation is. So the first one is he talks about space colonization. So in Magnus's essay, Antinatalism and the Future of Suffering, he actually talks about how humans could develop space travel and continue the species so that we can go around the galaxy and make sure that there's no other sentient life popping up around it. But Brian points out this: humans decrease wild animal populations on Earth by appropriating habitats in a world where life is currently abundant. However, if Earth originating intelligence colonizes space, it will increase populations of animals or other sentient beings throughout a galaxy where life is currently rare. It's plausible that a large human population will produce the technology to colonize space and spread suffering sooner, because there will be more human minds to work on these tasks. Since space colonization might create such vast amounts of suffering, speeding up this outcome seems quite bad. Plausibly, this consideration is even more important than whatever wild animal suffering a larger human population might avert in the short term. If so, then the recommendation to reduce the human population size might again be vindicated. And this does seem like a large risk. Spreading sentient life out into the galaxy and the universe where it currently isn't could massively increase the amount of suffering in the universe, but also the amount of individuals suffering. The second thing that Brian notes is about the creation of digital sentience. Now, obviously, consciousness is still a mystery, and we don't know if humans can recreate it through non-traditional means. But we could be living in a universe where it's possible to do that, and we just haven't done it yet. If this is the case, then human procreation and human innovation could be taking us down a road where we eventually get to a point where we can, as easily as clicking our fingers, create a new sentient being who can suffer, potentially on a colossal scale with numbers that we can't even imagine at the moment, and increase the number of individuals and the amount of suffering in the world far beyond anything we can even comprehend at the moment. So perhaps thinking about this, it's actually better to just cut our ethical losses and for humans to go extinct as soon as possible. Of course, this would mean that we'd be leaving wild animals behind to suffer, which Brian and Magnus are worried about, but it also means that we can't make the situation worse, which is something that we definitely could do. After all, if you think about it, there's much more potential for us to make this situation worse than to make it better, because the difference between a universe with no suffering and the suffering that we have now is much smaller than the suffering we have now and the amount of suffering that could potentially be. So where do we go from here? Well, I think a lot of this sounds like something that is a bit, sci-fi, far-flung, not really relevant to us as individuals right here and now. But I do think it's somewhat relevant to us as individuals because, as I said at the start, the antinatalist movement, even though it hasn't had much of an impact in the past, it's going in a direction where it could have much more of an impact in the future. And we could help determine where the efforts go to make the world a better place and how many individuals are going to be in that world. The antinatalist movement is only made up of the individuals within it, and we are each those individuals. If we want to individually pull our fingers out and put the effort in to be able to steer the antinatalist movement in the direction that we think it's best to go, then we could have an impact on where it goes, and that could have an impact on where the wider movement to make the world a better place goes. So I do think it's relevant to us as individuals. And for me personally, and I'm sure this is the case for many of the people watching, I genuinely don't know what the best way forward is. I've presented in this video two possible directions of there are compelling reasons to think that the human species, while it's sad that it would continue, is maybe the best thing to do. But then there's also compelling reasons to just hammer home the human-centric antinatalist message and try and have humans go extinct as quickly as possible in an ethical way, obviously. So I hope this video can play a part in spurring other people on to hosting discussions around this topic, making other videos about this topic, having individual conversations about it, and hopefully getting a more clear picture as to where we want to be nudging the antinatalist movement in the future in a collective way. And I look forward to hearing different people's thoughts in public discussions, forums, and in the comment section below. So I'll see you down there, and I'll see you in the next one.